The wind carried the smell of fear that morning. It rolled down from the high country of the Wyoming Territory across the frozen ruts of the wagon road and settled like a cold hand on the muddy main street of Dead Man's Creek. October of 1881. The kind of October when the sky turns the color of old iron and the cottonwoods stand bare against the wind, their leaves long since stripped away by the first hard frost. A young woman knelt in the mud. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was 22 years old, and she had traveled 1,800 miles from the city of Philadelphia to die in this place. She did not know yet that she was going to die. She knew only that her wedding dress, the one she had stitched by candlelight in the dormitory of the St. Joseph Home for Girls, was now soaked through with mud the color of old blood. She knew that her hands were tied behind her back with a length of red velvet rope, the kind a man might use to tie the curtains in a parlor. And she knew that the rope had been chosen on purpose because the men who had bound her wanted to humiliate her before they sold her. She held something tightly to her chest, even with her hands behind her back. A small wooden chest no bigger than a Bible balanced on her knees. It contained everything she owned in this world: a nightgown, a worn copy of the Holy Scriptures, a lace handkerchief that had belonged to her mother, and at the very bottom beneath the folded linens, a single letter creased and recreased so many times that the paper had grown soft as cloth. The letter was signed by a man named Nathaniel Hollister, and the man named Nathaniel Hollister did not exist. The auctioneer climbed up onto the platform of rough pine boards. His name was Cyrus Doyle, and he owned the Black Dog Saloon, and he had a long jaw split by a white scar that ran from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth. He smiled when he was about to make money. He was smiling now. He raised a leather riding crop above his head, and the crowd of 70 or 80 men fell silent. Trappers in greasy buckskin, miners with coal black under their fingernails, outlaws with prices on their heads, men who had ridden in from Montana and the Dakotas because word had spread that there was something special at the Black Dog this Sunday morning. A virgin from Philadelphia, 22 years old, red hair like a sunset, educated by the sisters, fair of skin, untouched, verified by a physician's certificate, gentlemen, all signed and proper. Clara stared down at the mud and prayed. She prayed the way the sisters had taught her, with her lips barely moving, her words a whisper, meant only for the ears of God. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. She did not pray to be rescued. She had given up on rescue. She prayed only that she might die before the man who bought her could put his hands on her body. Out beyond the edge of the crowd, where the cottonwoods grew thick along the bank of the creek, a man stood beside his horse and did not move. He was a tall man with shoulders broad as a barn door, and he wore a heavy coat made from the hide of a grizzly bear he had killed himself. His beard was the color of dark walnut, with threads of silver running through it. His eyes were the color of cold steel. His name was Jacob Hollister, and he was 36 years old, and on his chest, hidden beneath the heavy coat, was a tarnished silver star that had once made him a Texas Ranger. Beside him stood his younger brother, Samuel, and the two men watched the auction begin, and Jacob's hand rested on the stock of a Sharp's buffalo rifle, and his finger had not yet moved to the trigger, but it was close, very close. 5 weeks earlier, Clara Whitmore had stood in a small dormitory room in the city of Philadelphia, folding her clothes into the same wooden chest she now carried in the mud of a Wyoming street. She was 22 years old, and the rules of the St. Joseph Home for Girls were clear and unbending. At 22, a girl was no longer a girl. She must leave. She must find her place in the world. Clara had no place in the world. Her father, a tailor named Henry Whitmore, had died of consumption when she was 12 years old. She remembered him coughing into a white handkerchief that came away red, and she remembered the way her mother had wept silently in the kitchen, so the children would not hear. Her mother, Margaret, had died 3 years later of a weakness in the heart. Clara had been 15 when she became an orphan. Sister Agatha had taken her in at St. Joseph and had taught her to read and to write and to sew. And Clara had grown into a woman in those quiet rooms with the smell of beeswax candles and the murmur of evening prayers as the rhythm of her life. She was not unaware of her own beauty. The other girls had told her often, "Your hair is the color of fire, Clara. Your eyes are like the sea in summer." The boys who delivered the milk had stared at her, and the boys who delivered the coal had stared at her. And Sister Agatha had told her always to keep her eyes on the ground when she walked through the streets. A modest woman, the sister said, does not invite the gaze of men. But now Clara was 22, and she had to leave, and she had nowhere to go. It was Sister Agatha herself who placed the newspaper in Clara's hands. Matrimonial news. The pages were thin and cheap, smudged with ink. Sister Agatha had circled an advertisement with a stub of pencil. A Christian gentleman, the advertisement read, 35 years old, owner of a prosperous cattle ranch in the Wyoming Territory, devout, honest, seeking a wife of good character, will provide. Address replies to Mr. Nathaniel Hollister in care of Dead Man's Creek, Wyoming. Clara wrote the letter that very night. The reply came faster than she had dared to hope. The handwriting was elegant, the words tender. He told her about the mountains. He told her about the wildflowers that bloomed in the high meadows in June. He told her about a small log house with a stone fireplace, and about how lonely the long winter evenings could be, and about how he longed for a woman of faith to share his life. They wrote to each other for 3 months. By the 2nd month, Clara had begun to dream of him. By the 3rd month, she was in love. He sent her a train ticket. He sent her a small ring of pure gold, plain and simple with no stone, only a band. He told her it had belonged to his mother. He asked her to be his wife. She said yes. She said yes 100 times in the privacy of her dormitory room before the small mirror above her wash basin, practicing the word, as though it were a song she had not yet learned to sing. She left Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in late September. The sisters wept as she boarded the train. Sister Agatha pressed a small leather Bible into her hands, and made the sign of the cross over her forehead. Clara waved from the window as the train pulled away from the platform, and she did not look back because she did not want anyone to see that she was crying. 8 days on the railroad. Pittsburgh, Chicago, Omaha, Cheyenne. The country grew flatter and emptier with each passing day, and the towns grew smaller and rougher. And the men on the train began to look at her, the way the boys in Philadelphia had never quite dared to look at her. She kept her eyes on her Bible. She read the Psalms. She held the small gold ring in her closed fist and she prayed. In Cheyenne, she boarded a stagecoach. 4 more days jolting over rutted roads through country that grew wilder with every mile. There was an old woman on the stagecoach, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who wore black bombazine and smelled of camphor. On the second day, Mrs. Henderson leaned across the cramped compartment and said something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. "Child," she said, "are you certain about this man who waits for you?" Clara smiled and showed her the ring. The widow's face did not change. She studied Clara for a long moment, and then she said, "I have lived in this territory for 30 years. The name Hollister belongs to 2 trappers who live alone up in the high country. They are not ranchers. They have no wives. Be careful, child. Be very careful." Clara had told herself the woman was mistaken. The stagecoach reached Dead Man's Creek at dusk on a Thursday evening. There was no one to meet her. The driver climbed down from his box and unloaded her wooden chest into the mud of the street, and he pointed with a calloused thumb toward a long, low building with a peeling sign that read, "Black Dog Saloon." "Your party is waiting in there, miss," he said. He climbed back onto the stagecoach and drove away, and Clara stood alone in the gathering dark, and she felt for the first time the cold breath of true fear move along her spine. She walked into the Black Dog Saloon carrying her wooden chest before her like a shield. The man at the bar turned to look at her and he smiled. And his smile was the smile of a wolf that has finally cornered a lamb. His name was Cyrus Doyle. Beside him stood a smaller man with a scarred face and a derby hat pulled low over his eyes. That man was Mortimer Crane. They were the architects of her ruin. Doyle did not waste words. He told her in a voice so calm it sounded almost gentle that Nathaniel Hollister did not exist. He told her that Mortimer Crane placed advertisements in the matrimonial papers of the eastern cities. Advertisements aimed at orphan girls who had no one to ask questions for them, no fathers or brothers to make inquiries, no one in all the world to come looking when they vanished. He told her that the girls were sold to him, Cyrus Doyle, at the price of $200 apiece. And he told her that she would be sold again at auction to the highest bidder among the rough men of the Wyoming Territory. Clara screamed. She screamed and she dropped her wooden chest and she tried to run for the door, but 2 men caught her by the arms before she had taken 3 steps. They dragged her into a small room behind the bar, and they locked the door, and for 4 days and 4 nights, she was kept in that room, and she was given food and water and a clean dress, but no one touched her. Doyle had explained why in his calm and gentle voice. A virgin would fetch 5 times the price of a girl who was not. He could not afford to spoil his merchandise. On the night before the auction, Clara knelt on the rough plank floor of that little room, and she lifted her face toward the small high window, and she prayed. She prayed the way she had been taught to pray as a child, when the world was simple and God was kind. She prayed for the courage to die. She prayed that the Lord would take her home before the next sunrise, before the auctioneer's hammer fell, before any man could put his hands on her. She did not know that on the other side of the saloon wall, in the cold mud of the alley, a tall man stood in the shadow of the cottonwoods and listened to her prayer. The moonlight glinted off the silver star pinned to his coat. His hand was on the stock of a Sharp's buffalo rifle, and he was making a prayer of his own, though it was not addressed to God. It was addressed to a woman who had been dead for 11 years. "I will not be late this time, Rebecca. I swear it on my soul." 25 miles to the north, where the Wind River Mountains reared their white peaks against the autumn sky, there was a place the old trappers called Silver Wolf Pass. It was a narrow saddle of rock between two high ridges, and below it lay a hidden valley shaped like a bowl. And in the heart of the valley stood a log cabin that had been built with such care that it seemed to have grown out of the earth, rather than to have been put there by the hands of men. 2 brothers had built that cabin, working through the summer of 1873, lifting the heavy logs into place with their own backs and a single mule. They had been running away when they built it, though they would not have used that word. They had been looking for a place where the world could not find them, and they had found it, and they had stayed for 8 years. Jacob Hollister was 36 years old in the autumn of 1881. He stood 6 feet and 5 inches tall, and his shoulders were as broad as the yoke of an ox, and there was something in his eyes that made other men look away. He had been a Texas Ranger once, and he had been a husband, and he had been a father. He was none of those things any longer. He had been 27 years old when the cholera came to the small Texas town where he had built a home for his young wife, Rebecca, and their 2-year-old son, Daniel. He had been 6 weeks away from home, riding hard along the Mexican border with a posse of rangers in pursuit of the younger gang. When he came home, he found the town under quarantine, and he found that the sick had been gathered into a barn at the edge of town, and the doors of the barn had been barred from the outside. And inside the barn, his wife and his son lay dying of a sickness that no man could fight. He had stood outside that barn for 3 days. He had heard Rebecca calling for water through the cracks in the wooden walls. He had heard Daniel crying for his father. He had not been allowed to enter because if he had entered, he too would have died, and there would have been no one left to bury them. On the 4th day, the crying had stopped. The townsmen had come, and they had soaked the walls of the barn with kerosene, and they had set the barn on fire, and they had burned everything inside it. And afterward they had buried the ashes in a single pit at the edge of town, with no marker. Jacob Hollister had taken off his Texas Ranger star that night. He had not worn it again until the day he rode down to Deadman's Creek to save Clara Whitmore. He had taken his younger brother, Samuel, who was 25 years old, and as broken-hearted as he was, and he had ridden north into the high country, and he had built the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass, and he had sworn an oath to himself that he would never again allow himself to care for any human being, because to care was to suffer, and he had suffered enough. Samuel Hollister was 33 years old in the autumn of 1881. He was as tall as his brother, though leaner, and his hair was lighter and his eyes were a softer brown, and he had once been a man who laughed easily. He did not laugh easily anymore. There had been a girl 7 years before in the town of Lander. Her name had been Ruth Caldwell, and she had promised to marry him, and she had worn his ring for 19 months. And 1 month before the wedding, she had run off with a Boston merchant who had passed through Lander on his way to the gold fields of California. She had left a note. The note had said only, "Sam, I cannot live the life of a poor blacksmith's wife. Forgive me." He had not forgiven her. He had not forgiven himself either for being so foolish as to believe a woman's promise. He had built a forge beside the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass, and he had become the finest blacksmith in that part of the territory, and he made horseshoes and hinges in the heads of axes, and he traded them for what he and his brother needed. He did not trust women. He did not expect to ever marry. He had made his peace with the long quiet of the mountains, and he was content in his solitude, and he had not known until that October afternoon when his brother spoke a single sentence beside the woodpile that his peace was about to be broken. It happened this way. Samuel had come home that morning from a 3-day trip down to the town of Lander. He had brought back flour and salt and lead for casting bullets, and he had also brought back a folded slip of paper that the old innkeeper, Pete Calloway, had pressed into his hand at the last moment. Pete had said, "Give this to your brother Sam, and tell him I am sorry it falls to me to be the one to tell him." Samuel waited until the supplies were unloaded. Then he found his brother behind the cabin, splitting wood with the steady rhythm of a man who has been splitting wood for a very long time. The axe rose. The axe fell. The split logs tumbled away on either side. Jacob did not pause when his brother approached. Brother Samuel said, "There is news from Dead Man's Creek." The axe paused at the top of its arc. Then it descended and the log split clean down the middle, and Jacob lowered the axe and turned to face him. Samuel handed him the folded slip of paper. "Doyle has another girl," he said, "a virgin, from Philadelphia, 22 years old, red hair. The auction is on Sunday." And Jacob listened to me carefully. "The girl believes she is coming to Wyoming to marry a man named Nathaniel Hollister." Jacob did not move for a long moment. The wind sighed through the pines. Somewhere far above, an eagle cried. Then he set down the axe. "So it has come to this," he said. "They are using our name now, our father's name." He unfolded the slip of paper and read it once, and then he read it twice, and then he folded it and slid it into the breast pocket of his shirt. And his face did not change, but Samuel saw the muscle work along his brother's jaw, and Samuel knew what that meant. Reverend William Hollister. Their father had stood in the pulpit of a small clapboard church in eastern Tennessee for 30 years, and he had preached the gospel of mercy to a congregation of farmers and mill workers, and he had taught his 2 sons that there was no calling on this earth more sacred than the protection of those who could not protect themselves. He had died of consumption in 1863. His sons had carried his name out into the world and across the broken country of the war years, and Jacob had carried it into the Texas Rangers, and they had honored it as best they could. And now a man named Mortimer Crane was using that name to lure orphan girls to their destruction in the saloons of the Wyoming Territory. Inside the cabin, Samuel reached into his coat and brought out something else. A small rectangle of tin the size of a playing card coated on one side with a dark photographic emulsion. A tintype. The image was that of a young woman seated on a stool in a photographer's studio. Her hands folded in her lap, her hair piled in soft waves above her ears. She was not smiling. She was looking directly into the lens of the camera, and her eyes were enormous. And there was something in those eyes that made Jacob set the tintype down on the table and walk to the window and stand there with his back to his brother for a very long time. "Pete stole it," Samuel said quietly. "Doyle was drunk. Pete is sorry. He is an old man, and he could not do more." Jacob did not turn around. "She looks like Rebecca," Samuel said. "I know," said Jacob. His voice was hoarse. "I know she does." He turned at last and walked back to the table and picked up the tintype and looked at it again. The girl in the picture was not Rebecca. She was younger than Rebecca had been when Jacob met her. Her hair was redder, her face was thinner, but the eyes were the same. The eyes of a woman who had not yet learned that the world could be cruel. "Saddle the horses," Jacob said. "We ride at first light." They sat together that night beside the stone fireplace, and they did not speak for a long while. And the fire burned low, and at last Samuel said, "Brother, you have not gone down into Dead Man's Creek for 3 years. Not since we tried to save the O'Donnell girl." "I know it," Jacob said. "She died anyway," Samuel said. 6 months later. "I know that too." "Then why this one? Why now?" Jacob looked at the tintype where it lay on the rough plank table, and he said, "Because they are using our Father's name. Because if I do not stop them, they will use it again and again. And there will be 100 girls like the O'Donnell girl. And I cannot live with that. I have lived with too much already." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I have a list." Samuel turned to look at him. "You have what?" "A list," Jacob said. "I have kept it for 3 years. The names of every girl I have heard of who came west on one of Crane's advertisements. The towns where they ended up. The ones I know are dead. The ones I think are still alive. I have not spoken of it because I did not want to speak of it. But I have kept it. There are 18 names on the list, Samuel. 6 of them are dead that I know of. 6 more are missing. That leaves 6 who may yet be saved. And one of them is the girl in this picture." Samuel stared at his brother, and he saw perhaps for the first time in 8 years that the man across the fire had never truly been at peace in the high country. He had only been waiting for a reason to come down from the mountain, waiting for a moment when the weight of what he had failed to do for Rebecca might be balanced by what he could yet do for someone else. "I am with you," Samuel said. "Whatever it costs, I am with you." Jacob nodded once. He picked up the tintype and slid it carefully into the breast pocket of his shirt, beside the folded slip of paper that Pete had sent. He stood up and he walked to the corner of the cabin, where his Sharps buffalo rifle stood in its leather case. And he lifted the case down, and he laid it on the table, and he began to clean the rifle. Outside, the wind rose in the high pines, and somewhere on the slopes above the cabin, a wolf began to sing. And the song was lonely and old, and it carried far across the dark valleys of the Wyoming Territory. The morning of the auction broke gray and cold over Dead Man's Creek. The mud in the street had frozen during the night into hard ridges, and the breath of the men gathered before the Black Dog Saloon rose in white plumes that drifted away on the wind. There were more than 70 of them, perhaps 80, drawn from 100 miles around, by the rumor that something rare and beautiful was to be sold that morning. A platform of rough pine boards had been built in front of the saloon. On the platform stood Cyrus Doyle in a clean black coat and a string tie, his scarred jaw shaved smooth for the occasion. Beside him stood Mortimer Crane in his derby hat ledger book in hand, ready to record the transaction. They brought Clara out at 10 o'clock. She had been dressed against her will in a black silk gown that bared her shoulders and the upper part of her chest. Her red hair, which the sisters had taught her to keep braided and pinned, had been combed loose down her back. Her wrists had been bound before her with the length of red velvet rope. The cold air struck her bare skin like a slap, but she did not flinch. She had passed beyond flinching. She walked up the wooden steps of the platform, with her chin lifted, and her eyes looked out over the heads of the crowd. At some point on the gray horizon that no one else could see, and her lips were moving silently, and she was praying the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The bidding began. $100 from a miner in the front rank, a hard man with a yellow tooth at the front of his mouth. $150 from a trapper in oily buckskin. $200 in gold from a half-breed scout with a knife at his belt. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." $300, gentlemen. The voice that called the bid came from the back of the crowd, and the men nearest to the speaker stepped quickly aside because they recognized the voice. He was a tall man with a long black coat and a brace of pistols on his hips, and his name was John Kane, but he was better known across 4 territories as Black Jack Kane, and he had killed 12 men that the law knew of, and probably twice that many that it did not. There was a price of $700 on his head, and no marshal in the Wyoming Territory had yet been brave enough or foolish enough to try to collect it. $300, Kane said again, and he smiled up at Clara on the platform, and his teeth were very white in his lean, dark face. Clara closed her eyes. "For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Doyle raised his riding crop. $300, gentlemen. Going once, going, and then a new voice spoke from the far edge of the crowd. And it was not loud, but it carried over the heads of the men like the toll of a bell heard from a great distance, and every man there fell silent, as though a hand had been laid across his mouth. $500, the voice said, gold, in hand, right now. The crowd parted. Two horsemen rode slowly forward through the lane that opened before them. The lead horse was a great black gelding, 17 hands at the shoulder, and the rider sat the animal as though he had been born to the saddle. He wore a coat of grizzly bear hide, and his beard was the color of dark walnut shot with silver, and his eyes were the color of the steel of a gun barrel. Across the bow of his saddle lay a Sharp's buffalo rifle, 50 caliber, the kind of rifle that could put a hole through a man the size of a man's fist. Behind him rode a younger man, lighter-haired, with 2 Colt revolvers in their holsters and a short-barrel shotgun across his back. He did not smile. He did not need to. Black Jack Kane went very still. He had seen the face of the man on the black horse before, on a yellowed wanted poster in a saloon in Fort Worth in the year 1869. The poster had not offered a reward. The poster had been a warning. Texas Ranger Jacob Hollister, the poster had said. Outlaws of the southern counties be advised. Hollister Kane whispered. Jacob Hollister did not look at Black Jack Kane. He looked only at Cyrus Doyle on the platform, and he said again in the same flat voice, $500, gold. And after that, Doyle, you and I are going to have a conversation about the use of my family's name. Doyle's face had gone the color of skim milk. He was a man who had built his fortune on the careful judgment of which fights were worth having, and he understood at once that this was not such a fight. Mr. Hollister, he said, his voice catching slightly, this is purely a matter of business. $500, said Jacob, or I take her for nothing and you die where you stand. Choose now. Samuel Hollister tossed a leather pouch at Doyle's feet. It struck the wooden boards of the platform with the heavy metallic chime of gold coins. Doyle did not even pretend to count it. He bent and lifted the pouch, and he tested its weight, and he licked his dry lips, and he looked at the wanted man, Black Jack Kane, standing a few feet to his left, and he made his choice in a single instant. Sold, he cried, his voice cracking. Sold to Mr. Hollister for $500 in gold. Jacob Hollister swung down from the black horse. He climbed the wooden steps of the platform, and the boards groaned beneath his weight. And he stood for a moment in front of the trembling girl in the black silk gown. He did not look at her bare shoulders. He did not look at her bare arms. He looked only at her face. She had opened her eyes. She was looking at him as though he had ridden out of one of the pages of her old Bible, as though he were not a man at all, but something else. An angel, perhaps. A reckoning. She was not sure which. Her lips were still moving, and he understood without being told that she was praying, and he understood also that she did not yet believe she was saved. He said in a voice so soft that only she could hear it, "You are going to be all right now, miss. I give you my word." He shrugged out of his grizzly bear coat. The coat weighed nearly 25 pounds, and he handled it as though it weighed nothing. And he settled it gently across her bare shoulders, and he closed it across her chest with his own hands, and his hands did not linger. He drew his hunting knife from the sheath at his belt, and he cut the red velvet rope from her wrists with a single careful motion, and he caught the rope before it could fall to the platform, and he tossed it away into the mud. And then he lifted Clara Whitmore into his arms as though she were a child. She made no sound. She did not weep. She simply laid her head against his chest, and she heard the steady drum of his heart beneath the wool of his shirt. And for the first time in 5 days, she allowed herself to believe that she was not going to die that morning. Jacob carried her down the steps of the platform. At the bottom of the steps, he stopped, and he turned and he looked at Mortimer Crane, who was standing very still beside the auction block, with the ledger book trembling in his hands. "Crane," he said. Mortimer Crane looked up. In the same instant, Jacob's right hand came up with a Colt revolver in it, and the hammer fell and the report of the pistol crashed across the muddy street, and the derby hat leapt from Mortimer Crane's head as though it had been kicked by an invisible foot, and it spun away into the mud with a clean round hole punched through the crown. Crane fell to his knees. He did not seem to know that he was unhurt. Jacob holstered the Colt without looking at it. "You used my father's name," he said. "My father was a preacher in Tennessee for 30 years. He raised my brother and me to protect the helpless, not to deliver them up to the wolves. If I ever again hear of a girl coming west on one of your advertisements, Crane, I will return to this town, and I will find you. And I will not put a bullet through your hat. Do you understand me?" Mortimer Crane nodded. He could not speak. Jacob turned then and looked at Cyrus Doyle. "We are not finished, you and I," he said. "But we will finish another day." He carried Clara to the black horse. Samuel was already mounted and watching the crowd with the short-barrel shotgun across his thigh. Blackjack Kane had not moved. None of them had moved. They watched as Jacob Hollister settled the red-haired girl into the saddle before him and swung up behind her, his arms encircling her, to take the reins. And they watched as the two horsemen turned their mounts and rode slowly out of Dead Man's Creek and up the wagon road toward the high country. And not one man among them was foolish enough to lift a hand against them. The ride to Silver Wolf Pass took 7 hours. For the first hour, Clara did not speak. She sat in the circle of Jacob's arms with her head against his chest, and she watched the cottonwoods give way to pine, and the pine give way to spruce, and the trail climb steadily up out of the foothills toward the white peaks of the Wind River Range. The bear coat was warm around her. The smell of it was the smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and the clean sweat of a man who had ridden hard. She had never in her life been so close to a man's body. She did not feel afraid. In the second hour, she began to weep. She wept silently at first, and then in great shaking sobs that came up out of her chest, like something being pulled loose, and Jacob did not try to quiet her. He only tightened his arms a little around her shoulders and let her cry, and he guided the black horse with one hand on the reins, and once he murmured, Let it come, miss. Let it all come. There is no shame in it. In the third hour she slept. When she woke, it was dusk, and Samuel had built a small fire beneath an overhang of rock, and she was lying on a blanket beside the fire, with the bear coat tucked around her, and Jacob was sitting a little distance away with his back to her, and he was carving something with his knife, and the firelight was on his hands. She sat up. Jacob did not turn. He said, "There is broth in the kettle, miss. Sam has gone to water the horses. Are you hungry?" "I am Clara," she said. He turned then slowly. He looked at her across the small fire, and the shadows of the flames moved across his face. "Clara," he said. The word in his mouth was strange and gentle, as though he were saying a word in a language he had once known and almost forgotten. "I do not know your name," she said. "Not really." "Jacob," he said. "Jacob Hollister. My brother is Samuel. We live a few hours up the trail. There is a cabin. It is warm, and it is dry, and you will be safe there." She studied him across the fire. She studied the broad shoulders and the silver in the dark beard, and the eyes the color of cold steel, and she said, "You bought me, Mr. Hollister, for $500 in gold. What are you going to do with me?" He set down the piece of wood he had been carving. He laid the knife across his knee. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move behind his eyes, something old and tired and full of pain. And she understood suddenly, and without being told, that this man was not what she had feared he would be, that he was something else entirely, that whatever else might happen to her in the days to come, she would not be harmed in that cabin in the high country. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Clara, I am going to take you to my cabin, and you are going to have a room of your own with a door that locks, and you are going to sleep in a clean bed and eat at our table. And when the snow melts in the spring, I am going to put $500 in your hand, and I am going to take you to the railroad at Cheyenne, and you are going to get on a train, and you are going to go anywhere in the world that you want to go. And no man, including me and including my brother, will lay a hand on you in all the months between now and then. That is the word of a Hollister. My father was a minister of the gospel. I do not give my word lightly." She stared at him across the small fire. "Why," she said at last, "why would you do this for me? You do not know me." Jacob Hollister was a long time in answering. When he spoke, his voice was very low. 11 years ago," he said, "I lost my wife and my son to the cholera. I was not there. I could not save them. I have lived with that every day since. When I heard there was a girl in Doyle's saloon who had been brought west by men using my family's name, I made a decision. I decided that I was going to be there this time. That is all I can tell you, miss. That is all there is." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I am glad you came, Mr. Hollister." He nodded once. He picked up the piece of wood and the knife, and he went back to his carving, and Clara lay back down on the blanket. and she watched the firelight on the underside of the rock overhang, and somewhere in the dark, Samuel was singing softly to the horses, and the wind moved through the high pines, and Clara Whitmore, who that morning had prayed only for the mercy of death, fell asleep beneath the bare coat of a stranger, and slept without fear. They reached the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass 2 hours after dawn the next morning, and when she saw it with its stone chimney and its sturdy door, and the smoke curling up from its banked hearth, Clara Whitmore began to weep again. She did not know yet that the men who had sold her would not let her go so easily. She did not know that down in Dead Man's Creek, Cyrus Doyle was already counting the gold in his pouch and beginning to plan his revenge. She did not know that an old innkeeper named Pete Calloway in the town of Lander was opening a small ledger book and writing down a name and another, the names of girls still living in the dark places of the Wyoming Territory, girls who were waiting to be found. She knew only that she was alive, and that she was warm, and that the tall man who had carried her up out of the mud of Dead Man's Creek was lifting her down from the black horse and setting her gently on her feet at the door of his cabin. And he was saying in his low, quiet voice, "Welcome home, Miss Whitmore." And inside her chest, in a place she had thought was closed forever, something began very slowly to open. The first week in the cabin passed for Clara Whitmore as though she were moving through a dream. And the dream was not always kind, but it was not the nightmare she had expected. She slept. That was the first thing. She slept the way a wounded animal sleeps, deep and long and without dreams. And when she woke, she was confused for a moment about where she was. And then she remembered, and then she lay very still in the small, clean bed, in the small, clean room, and she listened to the sounds of the cabin, and she allowed herself to believe a little more. Each day that she was safe was the room they had given her was off the main hall on the ground floor. It had been Jacob's office before her arrival. He had cleared it out in a single afternoon, carrying his ledgers and his maps and his rifle stand up the narrow stairs to his own bedroom on the second floor. And he had brought down a single iron bedstead from the attic and set it against the inner wall. And he had placed a small wooden table beside the bed with an oil lamp on it. And on the wall above the bed, Samuel had hung a simple wooden cross that he had carved himself out of mountain ash. The room had a single small window that looked out across the meadow toward the line of pines, and through that window in the early mornings, Clara could see the steam rising from the backs of the horses in the corral, and she could hear the steady, bright ring of Samuel's hammer in the forge. The door of her room had a heavy iron bolt on the inside. Jacob had pointed to it on her first night in the cabin. He had said, "You may slide that bolt at any time you wish, Miss Whitmore. There is no key on the outside. No one will come through that door but you." He had said it without looking at her as though he were speaking of the weather. And then he had nodded once and walked away, and she had heard his bootsteps going up the stairs and into his own room. And a few minutes later, she had heard the cabin grow still. She had slid the bolt that first night. By the end of the first week, she was sliding it only out of habit, and by the end of the second week she had stopped sliding it altogether. She made friends with Samuel first. He was the easier of the two, and he seemed to know it. On the third morning he had appeared at her door with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and a careful expression on his face, and he had said, "Miss Whitmore, my brother sent me to ask if you would come to breakfast. He has burned the bacon, but the eggs are not bad." She had laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 5 weeks. The sound of her own laughter had startled her, and she had pressed her hand to her mouth, and Samuel had grinned at her and said, "There now. That is the first good sound this cabin has heard in a long time." After that, Samuel began to teach her things. How to bank the fire in the iron stove so that it would still hold a coal in the morning. How to tell a piece of cured venison that had begun to spoil from one that was still good. How to recognize the call of the gray jay and the call of the mountain chickadee and the call of the great horned owl that hunted along the ridge above the cabin in the blue hour before dawn. He told her stories about Jacob when they had been boys in eastern Tennessee, stories of small mischiefs and great kindnesses, stories of a serious older brother who had carried his younger brother on his back through a flooded creek when Samuel was 6 years old and could not swim. And Clara listened to those stories, and she watched the tall blacksmith's careful hands as he worked at his forge or at the kitchen table. And she understood gradually that Samuel Hollister loved his brother with the kind of fierce, settled love that does not need to be spoken aloud. She understood also gradually that Samuel Hollister did not look at her the way a man looks at a woman he wants. He looked at her the way a man looks at a younger sister who has come home after a long journey through dangerous country. There was kindness in his eyes, and there was concern, and there was sometimes a flicker of something almost like grief. But there was no hunger, and Clara was grateful for it. Jacob was different. Jacob was up before dawn every morning. She could hear his bootsteps on the boards of the upstairs hall before the first gray light had touched the windows, and she could hear the cabin door open and close, and a little later she could hear the steady, measured chock of his axe at the woodpile behind the cabin. He chopped wood for 2 hours every morning. The pile grew steadily through October and into November, until it stood as tall as a man and stretched the whole length of the cabin's north wall. And Clara understood after a while that he was not chopping wood because the cabin needed it. He was chopping wood because he did not know what else to do with the hours before sunrise. He took his breakfast quickly. He took his lunch out on the trapline. He took his supper in the long quiet of the evening, often after Clara and Samuel had already eaten, and he ate it standing at the kitchen counter with a tin plate in his hand, looking out the small window at the dark meadow. And he spoke perhaps 10 words in a day. When he did speak to her, his words were courteous and brief. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." "Pass the salt, please, Miss Whitmore." "The wood box is full. You need not carry any." She had asked Samuel about it one afternoon as they were shelling beans together at the kitchen table. Samuel had been quiet for a while. He had set down a handful of beans and he had looked at her across the table, and he had said, "Clara, my brother is not cold to you. He is afraid." "Of me?" she had asked. Of himself, Samuel had said, "He has not been to a church in 11 years. He has not looked at a woman with kindness in 11 years. When he saw you on that platform in Dead Man's Creek, the first thing he saw was Rebecca. Then he saw you. He is trying very hard right now to know the difference, and he is a stubborn man, and it is taking him some time. Be patient with him. He will find his way." Clara had thought about that all afternoon. That evening, when the supper dishes were cleared, and Samuel had gone out to the forge to bank the fire, she had taken a tin cup of coffee from the kettle on the stove, and she had carried it out the back door of the cabin and across the trampled snow of the yard to the woodpile. Jacob was there. He had a kerosene lantern hanging from a nail driven into the cabin wall, and he was splitting kindling in the small, bright circle of its light. The axe rose and fell. The split sticks tumbled away into the snow. She stopped a few paces away from him. He paused at the top of his stroke. He turned his head. The lantern light fell across the dark walnut beard and the silver in it, and she saw the surprise on his face. And then she saw him master the surprise. "I brought you coffee," she said. He set the axe carefully head down in the chopping block. He pulled off his leather work glove and took the cup from her hand. His hand was warm and rough and very large. The cup looked small in it. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. And then, because she had thought about this all afternoon, she added, "You may call me Clara, Mr. Hollister. After 2 months under your roof, I think we may have moved beyond Miss Whitmore." He stood looking down at her for a long moment. The steam rose from the cup of coffee between them. "Clara," he said. The way he said it was not the way Samuel said it. Samuel said her name the way a man says the name of a friend. Jacob said her name the way a man says a prayer he is not certain he has the right to say. "Then call me Jacob," he said. "Or Jake." "Sam calls me Jake." "Jake," she said. He nodded once. He raised the cup of coffee. He drank. "Thank you, Clara," he said quietly. She turned and walked back across the yard to the cabin, and she did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until the door closed behind her. That night she lay in her small, clean bed, and she listened to the wind in the high pines, and she thought about the shape of her own name in his mouth, and she did not slide the bolt across her door. The first snow fell in the second week of November. It fell in great soft flakes that drifted down through the windless air for 2 days and 2 nights. And when it stopped, the meadow was a smooth white field between the cabin and the trees. And the silence afterward was the deepest silence Clara had ever heard. The cabin grew warmer and smaller and more like a home. Clara took over the cooking because Samuel had told her cheerfully on the first day that he was a good blacksmith and a fair hunter but a terrible cook, and Jacob did not cook at all if he could help it. She baked bread 3 times a week in the iron oven, and the smell of the baking bread filled the cabin and drifted out into the cold air of the yard. And Jacob came in from his trapline one afternoon and stopped just inside the door and stood there with his hat in his hands and breathed in the smell of the bread. And he closed his eyes for a moment, and Clara saw it from the kitchen. and she understood that he had not smelled bread baking in a house in 11 years. She mended their clothes. She found to her astonishment that both men had been making do with shirts that were patched in 5 and 6 places, and that Jacob's only pair of wool socks had holes in both heels. She took the wool from the storage chest in the loft, and she set up her mother's old knitting needles by the fire in the evening, and she began to knit a new pair of socks for Jacob. She finished them on the night of November the 18th. She brought them out to the main room of the cabin after supper, when Jacob was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, with a cup of coffee and his rifle across his knees. Samuel had gone out to the forge. The fire burned low. The wind sighed in the chimney. Clara stood beside the rocking chair. She held out the socks. "I made these for you," she said. Jacob looked up. He looked at the socks. He looked at her. His face did not change, but she saw his throat work. He set down the cup. He set down the rifle. He took the socks from her hand, and he held them, and he turned them over carefully, and he did not speak for a long time. "The last person who knit me a pair of socks," he said at last, "was Rebecca. The winter of 1872. I still have one of them in my chest upstairs, just one. The other was lost." "I am sorry," Clara said. "I should not have presumed." "No," he said. He shook his head slowly. "No, Clara. Do not apologize." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were not the eyes of cold steel any longer. They were softer. They were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had felt just for a moment the weight of it shift in his arms. "I thank you," he said. "I thank you very much." He reached out without seeming to know that he was doing it, and his large, rough hand closed gently over her smaller one, the one that still held the trailing end of the wool. He held her hand for the space of 3 slow breaths, and then he seemed to remember himself, and he released her, and he looked back into the fire, and he said quietly, "Good night, Clara." She walked back to her room, and she closed the door, and she sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, and she did not know if she wanted to laugh or to cry, and so she did neither. And she sat there in the dark for a long time, and her heart beat as it had not beaten in 22 years. 3 days later, the wolves came. It happened in the late afternoon of a gray, cold day when the light was failing early, and the first hard wind of true winter had begun to blow down out of the high passes. Samuel kept a small flock of 7 sheep in a pole pen behind the forge. They were not for selling. They were for wool and for mutton, and Samuel had raised them from lambs, and he was fond of them. The first Clara knew of the wolves was the sound of the sheep screaming. She had been kneading dough at the kitchen table. She straightened up at the sound, her hands white with flour, and through the small window over the sink, she saw Samuel running across the yard with his Winchester in his hands, and she saw the snow flying up from his boots, and she heard him shout something to Jacob that she could not make out. She did not stop to think. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she went to the door, and she pulled it open, and she stepped out into the bitter wind of the yard, and she ran after Samuel toward the sheep pen. She was halfway across the yard when the second wolf came out of the pines. It came low and silent, its gray belly almost touching the snow, and it came from her left, and she did not see it until it was already in the air, leaping for her throat, with its yellow eyes wide and its black lips drawn back from teeth as long as a man's fingers. She had time only to throw up her arms and to scream a high, thin scream that did not even sound like her own voice, and then a great dark shape came past her from her right, and there was a heavy thud, and the wolf and the dark shape went down together into the snow in a tangle of fur and limbs and snarling and curses. It was Jacob. He had no rifle. He had not had time to reach for one. He had only the heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, and he had thrown himself at the wolf with nothing more than that. And now the two of them rolled together in the snow, and Clara stood frozen with her hands at her mouth, and she heard the wolf snarl, and she heard Jacob grunt with effort, and she heard the wet, hard sound of the knife going home once and again and a third time. The snarling stopped. Jacob rolled away from the body of the wolf. He came up onto his knees in the snow, and his left arm was dark with blood from the elbow to the wrist, where the wolf had taken him, and his breath came in white clouds. And he looked across the small space of trampled snow at Clara, and his face was the face of a man who had just understood something that he had been refusing to understand for a long time. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was hoarse. "Clara, are you hurt?" She shook her head. She could not speak. He came to his feet. He took 2 steps toward her, and then he stopped as though he did not trust himself to come any closer. And he stood there with the dead wolf at his feet, and the blood running down his left arm and dripping into the snow. And he said again, "Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am not," she whispered. "Jake, you are bleeding." He looked down at his arm as though he had not noticed it before. He flexed the hand. He nodded. "It is not deep," he said. "It will mend." Behind them in the sheep pen, Samuel had finished the work with the first wolf. He came across the yard now at a run, his rifle in his hand, his eyes going first to his brother, and then to Clara, and then to the dead wolf, and he stopped. And he understood at once what had happened. "Inside," he said, "both of you. Inside now. There may be more." There were no more. They came in pairs, that pack of mountain wolves, and the two had been the whole of it. But Samuel kept his rifle in his hands until the sun went down, and Jacob sat at the kitchen table with his sleeve cut away and his arm laid out on a folded towel. And Clara washed the long, ragged tears in his forearm with hot water and carbolic soap, and her hands were steady though her breath was not. She had never tended such a wound. She had never seen so much of a man's blood at such close quarters. But her hands did not shake, and she cleaned the wound the way Sister Agatha had taught her to clean the cuts of children at the home. and she dried it carefully, and she threaded the needle, and she stitched the deepest of the tears closed with 16 small even stitches. And Jacob did not flinch, not once, though she knew it must have hurt him a great deal. When she had finished and bound the arm in clean linen, she sat back, and she found that she was looking into his face, and that he was looking into hers, and that neither of them was looking away. Why, she said, her voice was very small, "Why, what said Jacob? Why did you come at it without your rifle? You could have died." Jacob was a long time in answering. "Because you would have died first," he said at last. "And I have lived 11 years with the memory of one woman dying because I was not there to stop it. I could not have lived another night with a second." Clara did not answer. She could not. There were no words in her for what was happening inside her chest. She reached out across the table, and she laid her clean hand over his, the one not bound in linen, and she held it. And Jacob looked down at their joined hands, and then he looked up at her face again, and he did not say anything more. And he did not need to. In the small hours of that night, when the cabin was dark and still, and the only sound was the moan of the wind in the chimney, Clara lay awake in her bed, and she listened to her own heart, and she understood finally, and without any further power to deny it, that she had begun to love the tall, hard man in the room above her own, and that he had begun to love her back, and that something had been set in motion now between them that could not be stopped or undone. She did not know yet that down in Dead Man's Creek, 25 miles below them through the pines, Cyrus Doyle had spent the last 4 weeks brooding over a leather pouch of gold and a humiliation he could not forget, and that Doyle had begun to make plans of his own. 3 days after the wolves, Jacob found the tracks. He had ridden out at first light to check the trapline along the western ridge, and he had come back in the middle of the afternoon walking his horse instead of riding it, and his face was very still. Samuel saw it from the door of the forge and came across the yard, and Clara saw it from the kitchen window and came out onto the porch with the shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and the 3 of them stood together in the cold yard while Jacob spoke. "There were 6 riders," he said. "They came up from the south along the ridge above the meadow. They got within 200 yards of the cabin, and then they turned and went back the way they came. They did not come down. They were watching us, Sam, counting us, counting the doors and the windows." He held out his hand. In his palm lay a brass cartridge case scuffed with snow. "45-70, he said. "Government issue, Army caliber." They were carrying military rifles. Samuel took the cartridge case and turned it over in his fingers when he said, "This morning before dawn." The tracks were fresh. The horse droppings had not yet frozen all the way through. Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he said, "There is something else." "What?" "Show me where you found this," Samuel said. Jacob led him along the western edge of the meadow, and Clara followed, walking carefully in the broken snow of their footprints. and they came at last to the great pine where Jacob had found the cartridge case. The pine stood at the edge of the trees, its lower branches trimmed away by some long-ago lightning strike, and on the smooth bark of its trunk, at the height of a tall man's eye, there was something that Clara had not been able to see from across the meadow. A piece of paper pinned to the trunk by the blade of a small bone-handled hunting knife. Samuel pulled the knife free. The paper came with it. He unfolded the paper carefully, and he read it, and his face hardened, and he handed it to Jacob without a word. Jacob read it. Then he read it aloud in a flat, quiet voice so that Clara could hear. "Hollister," the note said. "The girl belongs to me. You bought her with my money, but she was never yours to keep. You have 7 days to bring her back to Dead Man's Creek, along with $1,000 in gold for the trouble you have caused me. If you do not, I will burn your cabin to the ground with you and your brother inside it, and I will take the girl regardless. 7 days, Hollister. Signed, C.D." Clara felt the blood leave her face. She put a hand against the trunk of the pine to steady herself. Jacob folded the note. He slid it into the breast pocket of his shirt, where he had once carried the tintype of Clara's face. His expression did not change. 7 days, he said quietly. Then he looked at his brother, and he looked at Clara, and he said, "Inside, we have work to do." That was the night Jacob told her about Rebecca. He had not meant to. It had come about by accident in the way that the deepest things often do. Samuel had gone out to take the first watch of the night at the door of the cabin. The fire had burned down to red coals. Clara had not been able to sleep, and she had risen from her bed and pulled a blanket around her shoulders and come out into the main room of the cabin. And Jacob had been there, sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, with the Sharp's rifle across his knees and an oilcloth in his hands, cleaning the action by the dim red light. She sat down in the smaller chair across from him. "You should sleep," he said without looking up. "So should you," she said. He smiled. It was the smallest smile, barely a movement at the corner of his mouth. But it was a smile, and Clara thought she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. He set down the rifle. He set down the oilcloth. He looked into the fire for a long time. And when he began to speak, it was in a voice she had not heard before, low and slow and very careful, as though he were lifting something out of a place where it had been buried for a long time. And he was afraid that if he was not gentle, it would crumble into dust in his hands. He told her about Rebecca. He told her how he had met her in a small Texas town in the spring of 1869, when he had ridden in with a ranger company on the trail of a band of horse thieves. He told her how Rebecca had been the daughter of the town's only doctor, and how she had come out onto the porch of her father's house with a glass of cold buttermilk on a hot afternoon, and how he had taken the glass from her hand and looked into her eyes, and known in that single instant that he was going to marry her. He told her how he had courted her by mail for 14 months while he rode the ranger trails, and how they had married in the little Methodist church in her father's town in the summer of 1870. He told her about Daniel, born in the spring of 1871, a small red-faced child with a great pair of lungs and a great will to live, who had grown by the age of 2 into a small dark-haired boy who could sit a horse in front of his father and laugh out loud at the sound of the wind. He told her about the cholera. He told her about the 6 weeks he had spent on the Mexican border with the younger gang. He told her about coming home in the late summer of 1873 and finding the sign nailed to the fence post at the edge of town. Quarantine, the sign had said. By order of the town council. No entry. He told her about the barn at the edge of town. About standing outside that barn for 3 days and 3 nights. About hearing his wife call for water. About hearing his son cry for his father. About the way the crying had grown weaker and weaker, and on the morning of the 4th day had stopped altogether. He told her about the men who had come with kerosene cans afterward, about the burning of the barn, about the single pit they had dug at the edge of town, and the way they had buried the ashes there, with no marker and no service. About the way he had taken his Texas Ranger star off his vest that night, and had not worn it again until the morning he rode into Dead Man's Creek for her. He told her with his head bowed and his great hands hanging slack between his knees that he had sworn to himself 11 years ago that he would never love anyone again, because to love was to be made helpless. And he had been helpless once outside that barn, and he had sworn that he would not be helpless again. He fell silent. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved in the high pines. Clara rose from her chair. She crossed the small space between them. She knelt down in front of the rocking chair and she took his great rough hands in hers, and she lifted them up and pressed them against her own cheeks, and she felt his hands tremble. This man who had not trembled when he fought a wolf, bare-handed. And she said to him very quietly, Jake, you were not God. You could not have saved them. No man could have. And the fact that you stood outside that barn for 3 days instead of running away tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are. His eyes filled. He did not weep. He had not wept in 11 years, and he did not weep that night. But his eyes filled and he closed them, and he turned his face into her palm, and he held her hands against his cheek, with both of his own, and they stayed like that for a long time, and neither of them spoke. When at last she rose to go back to her room, he did not try to keep her. He only said very softly, Clara. Yes, she said. I am glad you came west, he said. So am I, she said. The next morning, the 4th visitor came up the trail. Samuel saw him first through the spyglass from the loft window. A single rider on a tall white horse picking his way carefully up the snowy switchbacks of the trail from the south. He wore a long black coat. He wore a wide-brimmed black hat. There was a tin star pinned to the breast of his coat, and the star caught the morning sun and flashed. Samuel slid down the loft ladder and into the main room of the cabin, his face grim. We have a visitor, he said. Federal star. White horse. 1 man. Jacob set down his coffee cup. He picked up the sharps. He looked at Clara, who had risen from her chair at the breakfast table and gone very still. Inside, he said, "Stay away from the windows. Sam, take the loft. Cover me from the east shutter." He went out onto the porch with the sharps cradled in his arms. The rider stopped his white horse at the edge of the yard. He raised both his hands, the right one slowly, to show that he was not going for a weapon. He was a thin man with a long face and a mustache the color of wet straw, and Jacob recognized him at once, and the recognition put no joy in him at all. "Pickett," he said. "Hollister," said Deputy Marshal William Pickett. "May I ride in?" "You may dismount where you stand," Jacob said. "State your business." Pickett swung down from the saddle. He kept his hands well away from his sides. He reached very slowly inside his coat. 2 fingers extended, and he drew out a folded paper sealed with a red wax seal. "I have a federal warrant," he said, "for the arrest of one Clara Whitmore on charges of grand larceny. The charge is that she did willfully and feloniously steal the sum of $500 in gold from the person of one Cyrus Doyle, citizen of the Wyoming Territory, and did flee with the same in the company of one Jacob Hollister, also of this territory. The warrant is signed by Judge Edmund Pierce of the Federal District Court in Denver. It is dead or alive Hollister. I would prefer alive." Jacob did not move. He did not even seem to breathe. His eyes had gone the color of cold steel again. "Pickett," he said, "I know who pays your salary, and it is not the United States government. I know who paid you to ride up here this morning, and it was Cyrus Doyle. The warrant in your hand was bought like the man who signed it. You and I both know that the law in this territory is for sale to the highest bidder, and Cyrus Doyle has bought himself a great deal of it." Pickett's face hardened. "Be that as it may," he said, "the paper is the paper. I'm going to walk into your cabin now, Hollister, and I am going to take the girl into custody, and I am going to ride her down to Cheyenne for trial. If you stand in my way, I will shoot you. I have 15 men camped 4 miles down the trail, ready to come up if I do not return by sundown. You cannot win this one, Hollister. Stand aside." Jacob smiled then. It was not a smile that any sane man would have wanted to see directed at him. "Pickett," he said, "I was a Texas Ranger for 9 years. I know the look of a real federal warrant. I know the look of the seal. The seal on that paper in your hand is a forgery. You and I both know it, and I am not going to stand aside, and neither are you going to take her." Pickett's right hand dropped to his pistol. He was a fast man. He had been a fast man for a long time, but he was not as fast as a Texas Ranger who had been waiting all morning for the chance, and Jacob's sharps came up to his shoulder in a single fluid motion, and the great rifle spoke once, and the sound of it rolled away across the meadow and echoed off the high ridges, and Deputy Marshal William Pickett spun half around and went down into the snow, clutching at the ruin of his right hand. The bullet had taken him through the wrist exactly where Jacob had aimed it. Pickett would never draw a pistol with that hand again. But he would live. Jacob walked down the porch steps. He walked across the trampled snow of the yard. He stopped over the writhing man, and he picked up the dropped pistol, and he tucked it into his own belt, and he looked down into Pickett's pale, sweating face. "You are going to ride back down to Doyle," he said. "You are going to tell him that the warrant did not work. You are going to tell him that the next man he sends up this mountain will not ride home. And you are going to tell him that when the snow melts in the spring, I am coming down to Dead Man's Creek, and I am going to settle accounts. Do you understand me, Pickett?" Pickett nodded. He could not speak. The pain had taken his voice. Jacob helped him to his feet. He helped him onto the white horse. He tied the wounded wrist tight with a strip of cloth torn from Pickett's own coat, so that the man would not bleed to death on the ride down. And then he stepped back and slapped the white horse on the rump, and watched as the horse and its broken rider went down the switchback trail and out of sight among the pines. Samuel came out onto the porch. Clara came out behind him, white-faced. "He will tell Doyle everything Samuel said. Doyle will come now, with everything he has." "I know it," said Jacob. "I want him to come. I am tired of waiting." That night by the fire, Jacob took Clara's hand. He said, "Clara, there is something I have to tell you. When this is done, when Doyle is finished and the men he has hired are finished, I'm going to ride down out of these mountains. I'm going to go after the other 6 girls that Crane brought west. There is a list. I have kept it for 3 years. There are 6 of them still alive that I know of, scattered across this territory and into Utah and Colorado, and I cannot leave them where they are. I have to go and bring them out. All of them, one by one. I am going with you." Clara said, "Clara, I am going with you." She said again, "Do not waste your breath telling me I cannot. Some of those girls will not trust a strange man no matter how kind he is. They will need to see another woman. They will need to see me. I am going." Jacob looked at her in the firelight for a long time. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "you are." He did not say what he had been going to say to her in that moment, the words he had been carrying around in his chest for 3 weeks, and had not yet found the courage to speak. He decided in that moment by the fire that he would not speak them yet. He would speak them only if they both lived through what was coming. He would speak them only on a night when there was no longer any shadow of dying over them. For now there was only the long preparation and the gathering of weapons and the shoring up of the cabin walls with felled timber and the laying out of cartridges in neat rows on the kitchen table, and the teaching of a Philadelphia schoolgirl how to lever a Winchester rifle and how to breathe out before squeezing the trigger. For now there was only the waiting. For now there was only the long-held breath of the high country before the storm. On the 4th night of their preparations, an old man came up the trail on a tired mule. It was Pete Calloway, the innkeeper from Lander. He was nearly 70 years old, and his joints had been giving him trouble for 15 winters. And he had not ridden a mule up a mountain trail in 10 years. But he had ridden one up this trail tonight. And he came stumbling into the cabin after Samuel had verified him through the spyglass. and he sat down heavily in the chair by the fire, and he accepted a cup of coffee with hands that shook, and he told them what he had come to tell them. Doyle had not hired 15 men. He had hired 30. And Black Jack Kane had thrown in with him with another 12 riders of his own. 42 men in all would be coming up the trail to Silver Wolf Pass within the next 48 hours. Pete reached into the inside pocket of his old wool coat. He drew out a small leather-bound book. He laid it on the table. "I have kept this for 3 years," he said. "Every time Crane came into my place drunk, I let him talk. He liked to brag. He thought he was talking to a stupid old man who would not remember in the morning. I remembered every word. There are 18 names in this book, Mr. Hollister. The names of every girl Crane brought into this country. The dates. The towns where Doyle sold them. What I knew of what became of them afterward. 6 are dead that I am sure of. 6 more I have lost track of. And 6 are still alive. And I know where they are. The names are written in the back with the towns." Jacob took the small leather-bound book in his hands as carefully as if it had been made of glass. "Mr. Calloway," he said. Pete shook his head. "I am too old to fight," he said. "I cannot ride down and shoot Doyle for you. I wish I could. But I can give you this, and I can ride back to Lander, and I can pretend I never came up here. And if anyone asks, I will tell them I have not seen you all winter. That is what I can do." Jacob held the book to his chest for a moment. Then he set it carefully on the table. "It is enough," he said. "It is more than enough. Mr. Calloway, when this is done, you will not want for anything for the rest of your life. You have my word on that." Pete smiled a small, tired smile. "I do not need much. Mr. Hollister," he said, "I only needed to do this one thing before I died. I have done it now. I can rest." He stayed the night. He left at dawn, riding the tired mule back down toward Lander, and he raised one hand to them as he went. And Jacob and Samuel and Clara stood on the porch and watched him go, and they did not know, but it was the last time any of them would see him in this life. Clara turned and looked up at Jacob as the old innkeeper passed out of sight among the pines. "How long do we have?" she asked. Jacob looked up at the gray sky. He looked down at the meadow, at the line of pines beyond it, at the long white miles of country between the cabin and Dead Man's Creek. "Tonight," he said. "Maybe tomorrow night. No longer." He turned and went into the cabin and began methodically and without hurry to load the guns. It was in the second hour after midnight on the night of December the 19th, in the year 1881, that the riders came up out of the pines and into the meadow before the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass. There were 42 of them in a long, irregular line, coming on slowly through the moonlit snow with their rifles laid across their saddle bows and the breath of their horses rising in white plumes around them. At their head rode Black Jack Kane on a tall sorrel horse. Behind him, well back where the bullets would have to pass through, a great many other men. First rode Cyrus Doyle on a fat gray mare, bundled in a fur coat, with a brace of pistols in his belt and a bottle of whiskey in his hand. Beside Doyle rode Bill Pickett, his right wrist bandaged and useless, a Winchester repeating rifle laid across his lap, his eyes hard and bright with hatred. In the cabin, Jacob Hollister stood at the window of the loft with the Sharp's buffalo rifle in his hands. Samuel knelt at the east shutter on the ground floor with the Winchester. Clara crouched at the north window of the kitchen with her own Winchester, the one Jacob had taught her to fire, and her hands were cold and steady and very sure. They had argued, the three of them, about whether she would go down to the cellar. She had won the argument. "I am not Rebecca," she had told Jacob 2 hours before. "I am not going to die in a barn while you stand outside helpless. If we live together. If we die together. Do not ask me again." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had nodded, and he had kissed her once on the forehead, and he had gone up the loft ladder to the high window, and he had laid the Sharps across the sill, and he had waited. In the meadow, Black Jack Kane raised his hand. The line of riders halted at 100 yards. Hollister Kane shouted across the snow, "Send out the girl and the gold, and we ride away. Make us come for you, and there will not be a stick of that cabin standing by mourning. You have 1 minute to choose." In the loft window, Jacob Hollister set the brass bead of his front sight on the buckle of Black Jack Kane's gun belt. He did not answer. He did not have to. He let his finger take up the slack in the trigger, and he breathed out slowly. And the long, cold bore of the Sharp's .50 caliber rifle settled into perfect stillness. The first shot of the Battle of Silver Wolf Pass was about to be fired, and the world that lay beyond it would not be the same world that had existed before. The Sharps spoke first. The great rifle bellowed in the loft of the cabin, and the muzzle flash lit the inside of the room like a sheet of summer lightning. And out in the moonlit meadow, Black Jack Kane was hammered backward off the rump of his sorrel horse. He hit the snow with both arms flung wide, and the snow came up around him in a fine white powder, and he did not move again. The line of 42 riders broke apart like a string of beads cut with a knife. Some of them spurred their horses forward. Some of them spurred their horses to the right and to the left, trying to flank the cabin. Some of them, the wisest of them, threw themselves down into the snow behind the bodies of their horses and began firing back. The night exploded into a long, ragged volley, and bullets thudded into the heavy pine logs of the cabin wall, and one came through the loft window beside Jacob's head and splintered the door frame behind him, and he did not flinch. He worked the falling block of the Sharps and slid in another fat brass cartridge and laid the long barrel across the sill again. Down on the ground floor, Samuel Hollister was firing the Winchester in a steady, measured rhythm, levering and firing, and every other shot found a target. He had killed 3 men in the first 20 seconds of the fight, and he knew it, and he did not let himself think about it. He had been a quiet blacksmith for 8 years. Tonight he was something older. In the kitchen, Clara Whitmore knelt at the north window with her cheek against the smooth wood of the Winchester's stock, and she watched a man on a piebald horse come riding hard, around the eastern corner of the cabin with a torch in his hand, and she remembered what Jacob had told her. Breathe out. Squeeze, do not pull. She breathed out. She squeezed. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder, and the man on the piebald horse jerked once and slid sideways out of his saddle, and the torch fell into the snow and hissed and went dark. The piebald horse galloped on past the cabin and into the trees, riderless. She had killed a man. She felt it in her body before she felt it in her mind. A strange, cold sensation in her stomach. And she set it aside and she levered another cartridge into the chamber. And she watched for the next one. The fight lasted 90 minutes. It was a long 90 minutes. Time did not run the way it usually ran. It stretched out and pooled in places, and in other places it lapped forward in great jumps. And Clara would remember afterward only fragments. The smell of black powder smoke heavy in the cold air of the cabin. The way the firelight from the hearth flickered on the splintered wood around the windows. Samuel shouting something to her from the other room, and her not being able to hear it over the ringing in her own ears. Jacob coming down the loft ladder once to fetch more cartridges from the kitchen table, and pausing for half a second to lay his hand on the back of her neck. A brief warm pressure of his palm. And then he was gone again up the ladder before she could turn her head. They tried to burn the cabin twice. The first time, 4 men with pitch pine torches came rushing across the meadow together. Samuel cut 3 of them down with the short barrel shotgun before they had crossed half the distance. The 4th man got close enough to fling his torch onto the cedar shingles of the roof, and then he too went down with a sharp's bullet through his chest. The torch caught on the dry shingles and the flames began to spread, and Clara dropped her rifle and seized the wooden bucket of water she had set ready by the back door. And she climbed the loft ladder past Jacob with the bucket in her hands, and she pushed open the small loft hatch in the roof, and she flung the water up onto the burning shingles. The flames hissed and steamed and died. She climbed back down the ladder, refilled the bucket from the kitchen pump, and set it ready again. The second time the fire took on the west wall. Samuel beat it out with a wet horse blanket, while Jacob laid down covering fire from the loft. By the time the false dawn began to gray, the eastern sky behind the high pines, 26 bodies lay scattered in the meadow before the cabin. 26 riders out of 42 had been killed, or so badly wounded that they could not ride away, and the remaining 16 had finally broken sometime in the last hour of the fight and had vanished back down the trail into the dark. Cyrus Doyle had been among the first to flee. Bill Pickett had ridden out beside him, holding his Winchester, one-handed with the reins between his teeth. It was not over yet. In the last gray minute before sunrise, a single figure tried to crawl away through the snow toward the line of pines on the east. He was dragging his right leg behind him, leaving a long, dark smear in the snow. Jacob saw him from the loft window and put down the sharps and came down the ladder and walked out into the meadow alone with his Colt revolver in his hand. He overtook the crawling figure 20 yards short of the trees. It was a young man. He could not have been more than 19 years old. He had a bullet through his thigh, and his face was the color of the snow. And when he saw Jacob standing over him, he flinched and threw up his hands and began to weep. "Please, mister. Please, I never killed nobody. They told me there was money. Please." Jacob looked down at him for a long time. The young man's revolver was on the ground beside him. Jacob picked it up. He uncocked the hammer and slid it under his own belt. He did not raise his Colt. "How old are you, son?" 19, mister. 19 years. "Where are you from?" "Iowa, mister." "Cedar County, my mother is alive there." Jacob squatted down on his heels in the snow. "Listen to me," he said. "You are going to live. I am going to bandage that leg and put you on a horse and send you back down the trail. When you come into Cheyenne, you are going to walk into the federal marshal's office and you are going to ask for Marshal Frank Reeves. You will know him. You are going to tell him that Jacob Hollister of Silver Wolf Pass sent you, and you are going to tell him every single name you know of every single man who rode up here last night. You are going to tell him about Cyrus Doyle and Bill Pickett and Mortimer Crane, and you are going to tell him about Judge Edmund Pierce in Denver. You are going to give him every name in your head. Do you understand me?" The young man nodded. He was crying openly now. And then said, "Jacob, you are going to get on a train, and you are going to go home to Cedar County, and you are going to write to your mother that you are coming home, and you are never going to come west of the Missouri River again, as long as you live. Do you understand me?" "Yes, mister. Yes. I swear it." Jacob bandaged the leg with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. He half carried the young man back across the meadow to the place where the riderless horses had gathered at the edge of the trees. And he caught one of the horses and helped the young man into the saddle, and he tied the wounded leg to the stirrup so that the boy would not fall. And he slapped the horse on the rump and watched it go down the trail in the gray light. When he came back to the cabin, Clara was standing on the porch with the Winchester still in her hands. Her face was streaked with smoke, and there was a small cut on her forehead where a splinter had caught her, and she was looking at him as though she had never seen him before. He walked up the steps. He set down the Colt. He took the Winchester out of her hands and leaned it carefully against the wall. He took her face in both of his hands, and he looked into her eyes, and he saw that she had been changed by this night, the way he had been changed by other nights long ago, and he was sorry for it. And he was not sorry because she was alive, and he was alive, and the long white meadow before them was the proof of it. "It is over," he said. "For tonight," she said. "Yes, for tonight." He kissed her then on the forehead, and he held her there on the porch in the gray light of the breaking dawn. And Samuel came out and stood beside them and laid a hand on his brother's shoulder. And the three of them stood like that for a long time. And the smoke from the burned shingles drifted up into the cold sky behind them. Doyle had escaped. Pickett had escaped. The work was not finished. They moved down to Beaver Creek the next afternoon. The cabin at Silver Wolf Pass had taken too much damage to live in through the rest of the winter. The roof was burned through in 2 places, and the west wall had been splintered by gunfire. and one of the windows had been entirely shot away. And Jacob walked the rooms once with a careful eye and pronounced it not worth the labor of repair until spring. Pete Calloway had a small cabin at Beaver Creek 12 miles east through the pines that he had not lived in for 6 years. Pete had told Jacob about the cabin a long time ago and had given him the right to use it any time he wanted. And now Jacob meant to take him up on that offer. They loaded the wagon with what they could carry, and they rode out of the burned meadow at Silver Wolf Pass at midday, and they reached Beaver Creek at dusk. The cabin there was smaller than the one at Silver Wolf Pass, but it was tight and warm and well built, and Pete had stocked it with flour and salt pork and dried beans and a cord of split firewood, as though he had known they were going to need it. There was a note on the kitchen table in Pete's careful hand. Take what you need. Stay as long as you must. The place is yours through the winter. P.C. Jacob read the note twice. He set it down. He did not say anything, but Clara saw him press the heel of his hand against his eyes for a moment, and she understood. That night, by the small stone fireplace of the Beaver Creek cabin, Jacob laid out Pete's leather-bound book on the table, and the three of them bent over it together. 6 names, he said. 6 girls still alive that we know of. We have until the spring thaw to find every one of them. Adeline Fairchild, 24 years old, from Boston. Last known location, the Rose of Cheyenne Saloon in the territorial capital. Working as a serving girl. Reported by Pete to be in poor health and despondent. Margaret Sinclair called Maggie, 21 years old, from a poor Scots-Irish family in New York City. Held against her will at the Buckskin mining camp outside Laramie, where she labored in the cookhouse for a man named Bull McGraw, under the terms of a 5-year indentured contract. Charlotte Ashford, 23 years old, from Chicago. Held at a boarding house in Rock Springs that catered to railroad men. Suffering, according to Pete's notes, from a dependency on whiskey that the proprietor had cultivated to keep her from running away. Lillian Prescott, 20 years old, from a tobacco family in Virginia. Sold to the proprietor of a low restaurant and lodging house in Salt Lake City, a man named O'Hannigan, who was known to have a violent temper and a record of assaults in St. Louis. Beatrice Holloway, 26 years old, from Baltimore. Working as a hired girl in the household of a prosperous merchant in Casper. Had been moved between 3 different establishments in the last 3 years, and was reported by Pete to be hardened and wary and unlikely to trust strangers. Genevieve Marlowe called Eve, 19 years old, the youngest, from Connecticut. Currently held as a chambermaid in the personal household of Judge Edmund Pierce in Denver, the same federal judge who had signed the false warrant Pickett had carried up the trail. 6 names, 4 cities, 3 months of winter. Jacob looked at Samuel across the table. "Brother," he said, "I cannot ask you to come." Samuel almost smiled. "You are not asking," he said. "I am telling. We ride together the way we have always done. Where do we start?" They started with Cheyenne. It was the closest. It was also the easiest in the bitter way of these things, because Adeline Fairchild was already a woman who had given up. They found her in a small back room above the Rose of Cheyenne Saloon, where the proprietor had moved her when she had become too ill to wait tables. She was 6 months along with the child of an outlaw who had been hanged in Laramie the previous summer, and she had not eaten a full meal in 3 weeks, and she had told the proprietor that she did not intend to last the winter. Jacob paid the proprietor $200 for her release. The proprietor, a thin, nervous man, took the money and made no objection. Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed for the entire night. She held Adeline's hand. She did not preach. She did not promise her heaven. She told her in a quiet, steady voice that there was a cabin at Beaver Creek where there was a fire and a kettle and a clean bed, and that there was a baby coming in the spring, and that the baby was going to need its mother, and that she... Clara knew something about being a young woman who believed she had nowhere left to go, and that she was here to tell Adeline that she had been wrong when she had believed that, and that Adeline was wrong now. By morning, Adeline was eating. By the second day, she was on her feet. They put her in the wagon with extra blankets, and they took her home to Beaver Creek, and Adeline Fairchild, who had been ready to die in a back room above a saloon, slept that first night under a clean quilt by a clean fire, and woke at dawn to the sound of birds. And she would tell people many years later that she had heard birds song that morning that she had not heard since she was a child in Boston. They went next to Laramie. Bull McGraw was a different sort of problem. He was a great heavy bull of a man with a red beard and small black eyes, and he sat behind a plank desk in the office shack at the head of the buckskin mining camp, and he laughed in Jacob's face when Jacob asked about Maggie Sinclair. "She is mine," McGraw said. 5-year contract signed and witnessed and filed proper with the territorial clerk. 2 more years to run. You cannot buy what is not for sale, Hollister. Jacob did not argue. He thanked McGraw for his time. He left. That night, late, when the lamps in McGraw's office shack had burned down, Jacob and Samuel came in through the back window. McGraw had been drinking. He was sprawled across the plank desk, with a bottle still upright beside his elbow. They tied him to his own chair with strips of his own shirt. They gagged him with his own bandana. They did not strike him. They did not need to. Jacob walked the dark camp until he found the cookhouse, and behind it the small, cold lean-to where Maggie Sinclair slept on a mattress stuffed with straw. She woke when he opened the door, and she sat up with her eyes wide and her hands lifted to defend herself. And Jacob raised his own hands and said very quietly, "Miss Sinclair, my name is Jacob Hollister. I have come to take you home." She came. She did not even pack. She walked out of the lean-to in the clothes she had been sleeping in, and Samuel wrapped her in a buffalo robe, and they put her on a horse, and the 3 of them rode out of the camp together in the moonlight. McGraw was found in the morning by his foreman. There was a folded paper pinned to his shirt with a small bone-handled knife. The paper said only McGraw. "Stop holding women under contract who do not wish to be held. The next time you do it, I will come back, and I will not leave you tied to a chair. Hollister." Maggie Sinclair did not speak for the first 3 days of the ride back to Beaver Creek. On the 4th night by the campfire, she told Clara in a thick Scots-Irish accent, the whole of what had been done to her in the 18 months at the buckskin camp. Clara listened. She did not weep. She did not look away. When Maggie was finished, Clara took Maggie's chapped red hands in her own, and she said, "You are not what they made you. You are what God made you. Do you hear me, Maggie? Do you hear me?" Maggie heard her. Charlotte Ashford in Rock Springs was the hardest of them. She did not want to come. The proprietor of the boarding house was glad to be rid of her, but Charlotte herself, hollow-eyed and shaking, could not be made to understand what was being offered. She had been on the bottle for nearly 2 years. The whiskey had become the floor under her feet. Without it, the world tilted. She wept and she cursed and she begged for a drink. And Samuel finally lifted her in his arms, as he might have lifted a sick child. And he carried her out to the wagon, and he sat with her in the back of the wagon all the way to Beaver Creek. And she clung to his coat and shook and wept the whole way. The first 3 weeks at the cabin nearly killed her. She raved. She tried to run out into the snow once in the small hours of a January morning in nothing but her shift. And Samuel chased her down and carried her back inside and wrapped her in blankets and sat with her by the fire until dawn. Adeline, who had been a nurse's daughter once long ago, told them what she remembered her father doing for men in such a state. Broth, sweet tea, a hand to hold, patience. By the end of January, Charlotte was eating. By the middle of February, she could walk to the kitchen on her own. By March, she had begun in a small, frightened voice to laugh again at the things Samuel said. Lillian Prescott in Salt Lake City was a confrontation with a dangerous man. O'Hannigan was a brawler who had killed at least once in a stand-up fight in St. Louis, and he carried a pistol openly on his hip in violation of city ordinance. And when Jacob walked into his low restaurant in the gray light of a winter afternoon and asked about Lillian, O'Hannigan laughed and threatened to call the constable. "Mr. O'Hannigan," Jacob said, "I was a Texas Ranger for 9 years. I have a copy of the criminal docket of the city of St. Louis for the year 1875. There is an entry in that docket concerning a man named Patrick O'Hannigan, charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of unlawful wounding. The charges were dropped when the principal witness disappeared. I imagine you would prefer that the constable not be called this afternoon. I imagine you would prefer to discuss terms." O'Hannigan stared at him for a long count of 3. Then he named a price. Lillian came out of a small upstairs room 10 minutes later with a cloth bag in her hand containing everything she owned. And she walked out of the building with Jacob and Samuel without looking back. And at the corner of the street she stopped. And she vomited into the gutter, and then she straightened up and wiped her mouth and said, "Take me anywhere, Mr. Hollister. Anywhere but here." Beatrice Holloway in Casper was the strangest of them. She was 26 years old, and she had been on the road of bad places for 3 years. And the woman who walked out of the merchant's back door to meet Jacob in the alley behind the great house was no longer the Baltimore girl who had stepped off the train at Cheyenne in 1879. She was harder than that. Her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had seen too much. She did not weep when Jacob explained who he was and why he had come. She listened. She studied him. When he had finished, she said in a flat, low voice, "Mr. Hollister, what is in this for you?" "Nothing, miss," Jacob said. "I owe a debt to a man who used my name to harm you, and I am paying that debt. There is nothing in it for me." Beatrice considered that. "I will come," she said. "But understand me, Mr. Hollister. I do not believe you yet. I do not believe any man yet. I will come because I have nowhere better to go, and you are offering me a roof. If your roof turns out to be like the other roofs, I will know it within the first week, and I will leave again, and I will not come back. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, miss," said Jacob. "We understand each other." It would take Beatrice Holloway 6 months in the cabin at Beaver Creek before she let down her guard far enough to weep in another woman's arms. And the woman she eventually wept on was Clara. In the long, quiet hour before an April dawn. And afterward, Beatrice would never speak of those tears. But she would never again look at Clara, as though Clara might be lying to her either. The last of the 6 was Genevieve Marlowe in Denver. She was the youngest. She was 19. She was working as a chambermaid in the household of Judge Edmund Pierce, and she was technically there of her own free will under a personal service contract that Pierce's lawyers had drawn up so airtight that Jacob, who had read the contract over McGraw's hospitality at the territorial clerk's office in Cheyenne, knew at once that there was no buying her out and no court that would help her. So Jacob did something else. He waited in Denver for 3 days. He watched the Pierce house. He learned the comings and goings of the judge and his wife and his servants and his deputies. On the 4th night, when Pierce was at a banquet of the Denver Bar Association and his wife was visiting her sister in Colorado Springs, Jacob entered the Pierce residence through a pantry window that he had spotted from the alley 2 days before, and he moved silently through the dark rooms of the great house. And he did not at first go looking for Genevieve. He went looking for the judge's private study. He found it on the 2nd floor. He found in the 2nd drawer of Pierce's roll-top desk a calf-bound ledger book with the judge's initials embossed on the cover. And he opened the ledger book, and he stood there in the dark with a single small bullseye lantern in his hand. And he read. Pierce had kept his own records. He had kept records of every payment he had received from Cyrus Doyle, from Mortimer Crane, from 4 other federal judges in 3 other territories, all of them named in the ledger by name and by the size of the bribe they had passed on or received. There were also records of a network of saloon keepers, of railroad police captains, of 2 senior officers in the United States Army, and of a deputy United States Marshal named William Pickett. It was Jacob saw at once the ruin of all of them. He took the ledger. Then he went and found Genevieve. She was asleep in a small, unheated room at the back of the 3rd floor. He woke her by laying his hand gently across her mouth, and when her eyes opened wide with terror in the dark, he leaned close and said in the lowest whisper, "Miss Marlowe, my name is Jacob Hollister. There is a place at Beaver Creek where there are 5 other young women like you. They are all alive. They are all safe. If you come with me now in the next 10 minutes without making a sound, I will take you to them. If you stay, I cannot help you any further. Decide." She decided. He carried her down the back stairs of the Pierce house, with her arms around his neck, and her head pressed against his collarbone, and Samuel was waiting in the alley with the horses. And within the hour they were riding north out of Denver, and by dawn they were 40 miles up the Cache La Poudre, headed for home. Pierce discovered the loss of the ledger at noon the following day. Within 24 hours, a federal warrant had been issued for the arrest of Jacob Hollister on charges of burglary and kidnapping. And within 48 hours, the warrant was on the desk of every deputy marshal in the Wyoming Territory. It did not matter. Jacob had already, before he left Denver, made a duplicate copy of the most damaging pages of the ledger, and he had wrapped that copy in oilskin, and he had handed it personally to United States Marshal Frank Reeves at the federal courthouse in Cheyenne on the morning he passed back through the city on his way north. Marshal Reeves read the pages standing up in his office. He read them once. He read them again. He did not speak for a long time. Then he looked up at Jacob across the desk, and he said in a voice that had carried weight in 5 territories for 15 years, "Mr. Hollister, do I understand correctly that you have just handed me the entire architecture of a federal corruption ring stretching from St. Louis to Salt Lake City?" "Yes, Marshal," said Jacob. "I believe I have." Reeves nodded slowly. "Then I believe," he said, "that you and your brother are going to find a great deal of weight removed from your shoulders within the next 60 days. There will still be fugitive warrants out under Judge Pierce's seal. But Judge Pierce, I believe, is about to find himself a former judge. And after that, the warrants will not be worth the paper they are printed on." He stood up. He walked around the desk. He held out his hand and Jacob took it. "Tell your brother Reeves said that the United States is grateful, even if it cannot say so out loud just yet." Jacob smiled very faintly. "I will tell him, Marshal." Within 3 weeks, Pierce had been removed from the bench and had been placed under his own arrest. Within 4 weeks, Bill Pickett had been arrested in a saloon in Cheyenne, with his bandaged wrist still in a sling. Within 6 weeks, 4 other federal judges in 3 other territories had begun to find that their careers were collapsing under them like rotten porches. Mortimer Crane, who had been hiding in a boarding house in Casper since the night of the battle at Silver Wolf Pass, was arrested in late March and brought back to Cheyenne to face trial for trafficking and fraud. He turned over against everyone he could turn over against, in exchange for a sentence of 30 years instead of the noose, and the names he gave brought down nearly 100 more men over the course of the following 6 months. The only one of the principal villains who remained at large that long winter was Cyrus Doyle. He had gone to ground in Dead Man's Creek. He had pulled the last of his money out of the Black Dog Saloon, and he had hired 4 bodyguards from out of the territory. And he sat in the back room of the saloon with a brace of pistols on the table beside him, and a bottle of whiskey by his right hand. And he waited because he knew in his bones that Jacob Hollister was coming back for him. The second week in May, the trail thawed. Beaver Creek ran high and brown under the willows, and the wildflowers came up along the meadow paths in a great rush. lupine and Indian paintbrush and wild iris, and the 6 young women at the cabin walked together among the flowers in the long blue evenings and laughed sometimes. And Adeline Fairchild's son was born on the 1st of May, a strong boy with a great pair of lungs, and Adeline named him Peter after the old innkeeper who had given them his book. On the morning of the 5th of May, 1882, Jacob Hollister rose before dawn and dressed in clean clothes and pinned the tarnished silver star of the Texas Rangers to the breast of his shirt. And he saddled the black horse, and Samuel saddled his own horse beside him. And Clara stood in the doorway of the Beaver Creek cabin in her nightgown, with a shawl around her shoulders and her hair loose over her back. "I am going with you," she said. "No, my love," Jacob said. He set down the saddlebags. He came back across the yard to the porch. He took her face in his hands. "Not this one. This one I have to do as the man I once was before I came up into these mountains. Do you understand me, Clara? I have to ride into Dead Man's Creek wearing this star, and I have to walk down that street, and I have to do this thing, and you cannot be there when I do it. Not because I do not want you, because of what it would do to you if it went the wrong way. And because I have to know in the moment when it happens that you are safe. I will wait," she said. He kissed her slowly and thoroughly, the kiss of a man going somewhere he was not certain he would come back from. Then he turned and walked back to the horse and swung up into the saddle, and he and Samuel rode out of the meadow in the first gray light, and Clara stood on the porch and watched them until they had passed out of sight among the pines. They reached Dead Man's Creek at mid-morning. The town was nearly empty. Word had run ahead of them. Word had been running ahead of them all winter. Cyrus Doyle's hired bodyguards had ridden out of town the night before, after their last paychecks had bounced at the bank in Cheyenne, because Doyle's accounts had finally been frozen by federal order. There were still perhaps 80 residents in Dead Man's Creek, miners and freighters and the few storekeepers who had families to feed, and they came out onto the wooden sidewalks in front of their establishments as the 2 horsemen rode slowly up the main street. And they did not call out, and they did not approach. They only watched. The Black Dog Saloon stood at the head of the street. Its doors were open. Jacob dismounted. He handed his reins to Samuel. "If he comes out shooting," he said, "you take him from the side. If he comes out talking, you let me handle it." "Yes, brother," said Samuel. Jacob walked up the wooden steps of the saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. Cyrus Doyle was sitting at a table at the back of the room. There was a half-finished glass of whiskey on the table in front of him. He had not shaved in 3 days. His scarred jaw was rough with stubble. There was a Smith & Wesson revolver lying on the table beside the glass. He looked up when Jacob came through the doors. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Doyle said, "You took your time, Hollister." "I had business," said Jacob. Doyle looked at the silver star on Jacob's chest. "That has no force here," he said. "You have not been a ranger for 11 years. That star is not law in this territory." "It is not law," said Jacob. "It is a memory. I am wearing it for me, not for you." "Stand up, Doyle." Doyle did not move. "I am not a gun hand," he said. "I never claimed to be. I am a businessman." "You sold women," Hollister said. "You sold a girl from Philadelphia for $500 in gold, to me having already bought her from Crane for $200, and you intended to sell her again before the night was out if I had not ridden in. You sold 17 other young women before her. You hired 42 men to come up to my cabin and burn it with my brother and my woman inside of it. You are not a businessman, Doyle. You are the worst kind of man this country grows. Stand up. We are going outside. The street is wide enough for both of us." Doyle's hand crept toward the revolver on the table. "I would not said Jacob. Not in here. Not with my brother covering the back door. There is one way out for you, Doyle, and it is to walk out to that street with me and face me the way men are supposed to face each other. You do that, and you have the same chance I have. You sit there and reach for that pistol, and Sam will come through that back door and put a round through you before your fingers have even closed on the grip. I leave it to you." Doyle stood up. He walked out from behind the table. He picked up the revolver and slid it into the holster on his hip. He walked past Jacob without looking at him out through the swinging doors, and Jacob followed 3 paces behind, and they came out together into the bright, cold sun of the street. Samuel was already mounted 50 feet down the street, with the short-barrel shotgun across his thigh. The few witnesses who had stayed in town to see this stood far back on the far sidewalks in doorways. No one was in the line of fire. The 2 men paced apart. 20 yards lay between them. Doyle stopped first, breathing hard. Jacob stopped a moment later, breathing easy. "Whenever you are ready," Hollister said. Doyle's hand went for his pistol. He was not slow. He had been a saloon keeper for 20 years, and a saloon keeper learns to be quick, or he does not last. The pistol cleared its holster, and the muzzle began to come up, and Doyle's thumb dragged the hammer back as it rose. He was not slow, but Jacob was a Texas Ranger. The Colt was in Jacob's hand and level and steady before Doyle's barrel had reached the line of his belt buckle. The Colt spoke once. The single shot rolled out flat and hard between the false fronts of the buildings, and Cyrus Doyle was knocked half a step backward, as though struck by an invisible fist, and the pistol fell out of his fingers, and he sat down very suddenly in the mud of the street, and he looked down at the dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt, with an expression of mild surprise. And then he lay back slowly, and the morning sun came down on his open eyes, and he was gone. Jacob holstered the Colt. Samuel rode up the street and reined in beside him. "It is finished," Brother Samuel said. "It is finished," said Jacob. They rode out of Dead Man's Creek that afternoon, and they did not look back, and they did not return. Mortimer Crane was tried in federal court in Cheyenne in July of 1882. He pled guilty to 14 counts of fraud and conspiracy in trafficking in exchange for the lesser sentence of 30 years at hard labor. He served his sentence in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, and he died there of pneumonia in the winter of 1898. having outlived nearly every man he had ever known. The wedding was on the 15th of June in the year 1882, in the meadow before the cabin at Beaver Creek. Reverend James Holloway came up from Lander to perform the ceremony. He was an old man with a long white beard, and he had been a friend of Reverend William Hollister in Tennessee 30 years before, and he had ridden 2 days on a borrowed mule to be there because he had told Jacob that he would not have missed it for any price. He stood under a small archway of cottonwood branches that Samuel had built, and Clara had decorated with wild lupine and Indian paintbrush. And the meadow grass was deep and green, and the sky over the Wind River Range was so blue that it hurt to look at it. Clara wore a dress of plain white linen that she had sewn herself through the long, quiet evenings of February and March. Her red hair was braided with the small blue and red wildflowers of the meadow. She walked up the grassy aisle on the arm of old Pete Calloway, who had ridden up from Lander 2 days before to give her away in place of a father long dead. And Pete was wearing a clean white shirt and a dark coat that had not seen daylight in 20 years. And his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. Adeline Fairchild stood among the bridesmaids, with her infant son Peter in her arms. Maggie Sinclair stood beside her, and Charlotte Ashford beside Maggie. Sober now for 157 days and counting, and Lillian Prescott beside Charlotte and Beatrice Holloway, who had finally agreed to stand among the others. And at the end of the line stood little Genevieve Marlowe, the youngest of them, smiling so hard that the tears were running down her cheeks. Samuel stood beside his brother as best man. When the time came for the vows, Jacob did not read them from the prayer book. He had asked Reverend Holloway for permission to speak his own, and the old Reverend had given that permission. And now Jacob stood in his clean dark coat with the Texas Ranger star pinned over his heart, and he looked into the eyes of the woman he had carried up out of the mud of Dead Man's Creek the previous October, and he spoke. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "11 years ago I buried a wife and a son in a single pit at the edge of a Texas town, and I swore upon their ashes that I would never love another living soul. I swore it because love had unmade me, and I did not believe a man could be unmade twice and live. I went up into the high country, and I built a house out of logs, and I tried to put the world away from me, and for 8 years I succeeded. And then on a gray October morning I rode down out of those mountains because some men I had never met were using my father's name to harm a girl I had never seen. And I came around the corner of a saloon, and I saw you on a wooden platform, and the world I had put away from me came back through the gap in my chest like a river through a broken dam. I tried to fight it. I lost. I am glad I lost. I will be glad I lost for the rest of my life. I take you now to be my wife, Clara, not because I bought you, not because circumstance threw us together, but because in the long, quiet evenings of this past winter, when I watched you teach a frightened child of 19 how to laugh, again I understood that God had given me against all justice and all expectation a second life. I will live that life with you and beside you until my last breath. That is my vow." There was a silence in the meadow. Beatrice Holloway, who had told Clara on the second day of their acquaintance that she did not believe in love, was crying. Clara took both of Jacob's hands in hers. "Jacob Hollister," she said, "I came west on a train because I had nowhere else in the world to go. I came in answer to a letter from a man who did not exist. The Lord, in His mercy, allowed that lie to bring me to a truth, and the truth was you. I take you to be my husband in the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass, and in any other cabin that the Lord may set our feet toward in sickness and in health, in want and in plenty, until the day comes when I cross to the far side of the river myself, and I tell those who waited there for you that I kept watch over you in the years between, and that I loved you all the days of my life. That is my vow." Reverend Holloway pronounced them married. Jacob bent his head and kissed her, and the meadow erupted in cheering. And Samuel stepped forward and embraced his brother for a long moment without speaking. And old Pete Calloway sat down very suddenly in the grass and put his face in his hands. It was at the wedding feast that evening that the last surprise of the long year came riding up the trail. A young man in the blue coat of the United States Cavalry, mounted on a tall bay gelding, came up the wagon road at sunset. He wore the bars of a captain on his shoulders. He had a clean-shaven face and brown hair the color of old wheat, and his eyes were the gray-blue of the Hollister men. He swung down from the saddle at the edge of the firelight, and he took off his hat, and he looked at Jacob across the dancing flames. "Cousin Jacob," he said, "I have come a long way. I hope I am welcome." The cabin grew very quiet. Samuel stepped forward first. He had recognized the eyes. "You are Robert," he said, "Uncle Henry's son." "Yes, sir," said the young man. "Captain Robert Hollister, United States Cavalry, currently posted at Fort Russell. I have been 3 years trying to find the two of you. I have a letter that I have been carrying, and I have been carrying it for a long time." He reached into the breast pocket of his blue coat. He drew out a folded paper yellow with age, sealed with a smear of ancient red wax. "This was given to me by my father before he died," he said. "He told me it was from your father, written on the day before he passed in the year 1863. He told me it was to be delivered to his sons Jacob and Samuel when they could be found. I have been looking for the two of you since I was commissioned. I have at last found you. Take it, cousin. It is yours, not mine." Jacob took the letter. He held it for a long moment. His hand was shaking. He broke the wax. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the careful schoolmaster's hand of a country preacher who had learned to write before the war. He began to read. He could not finish reading aloud. His voice broke on the third line. Samuel, standing beside him, took the letter gently from his hand and finished it for him, and his voice was steady, though his eyes were not. "To my sons, Jacob and Samuel. By the time you read this, I will have gone home to the Lord. Do not grieve over long. I have been ready for some time. I write tonight because the doctor has told me that tomorrow I may no longer have the strength to hold a pen and there are things I must say to you while I still can. You will inherit in the year of my passing very little of this world's goods. The farm is mortgaged, and the debts will eat what is left. What I leave to you instead is the name. Hollister. Be very careful with it. It is a small thing, a name in the eyes of the world, but it is the only thing a man truly owns. Wear it as I have tried to wear it for the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. That is the whole of the law and the prophets, my sons. Remember it. You will lose people. We all do. When you lose them, do not let the losing turn you into a stone. The great temptation of grief is to wall the heart, and a walled heart, my sons, is a heart that has stopped serving God. There will be in the years ahead of you women who will need you, and children who will need you, and strangers who will need you. And you must not be too far walled in to hear them when they call. Tear down the walls, my sons. Tear them down again and again, however many times you must. The Lord did not give us hearts to keep them safe. He gave us hearts to spend them. I will see you both, I trust, on the other side of the river. Your loving father, William Hollister. When Samuel finished reading, there was no sound in the meadow, but the crackling of the fire and the soft crying of Adeline Fairchild's infant son. Jacob stepped forward and embraced Captain Robert Hollister of the United States Cavalry, who was the son of his father's younger brother, and the two men held each other for a long time, without speaking. And when they parted, Jacob laid a hand on his cousin's shoulder and said, "You are welcome at this fire, as long as the fire burns, Robert. Tonight and any night you choose to come." Captain Robert Hollister stayed 3 days at Beaver Creek. On the second evening, he and the youngest of the rescued women, little Genevieve Marlowe of Connecticut, sat together by the fire, long after everyone else had gone to bed, and they spoke quietly. And on the third morning, when Robert mounted up to ride back to Fort Russell, he tipped his hat to her, and she colored and smiled, and 4 years later, they would be married in the chapel at Fort Russell, with Jacob standing as best man. 6 years passed. In the autumn of 1888, the cabin at Silver Wolf Pass had been rebuilt and enlarged. A new wing had been added on the east side to accommodate the children. A second stone chimney rose at the western end. The meadow before the cabin had been fenced for cattle, and there was a small flock of sheep and a smokehouse and a dairy. Clara Hollister sat on the porch in the long blue light of a September evening, with her 3-year-old daughter, Mary Rebecca, asleep against her chest. Mary Rebecca had her mother's red hair and her father's gray-blue eyes, and she had been named for the 2 women her father had loved, the one in the next life and the one in this. Out in the yard, her older brother, William James, who was 5 and had his father's dark hair, was kneeling in the grass with his uncle Samuel, watching gravely as Samuel carved a small wooden figure of a wolf with a hunting knife. Samuel had married Helen Whitfield, the niece of Captain Robert Hollister's commanding officer, in the autumn of 1884. They lived at Beaver Creek in the cabin that Pete Calloway had given them when he died. They had 2 children of their own, and a third, a small, dark-eyed girl, whose mother had not survived the journey out of a bad place that they had taken in and were raising as their own daughter. The 6 rescued women had scattered across the territories. Adeline Fairchild had married a blacksmith in Cheyenne in 1884, and now had 2 children in addition to little Peter. And she sent letters to Clara every Christmas, written in a careful schoolteacher's hand. Maggie Sinclair had saved enough money working as a seamstress in Lander to take a train back to New York City in the spring of 1886, and Clara had received a letter from her in the autumn of that year, telling her that she had been reunited with her younger sister and was working in a respectable dressmaker's shop on Hester Street. Charlotte Ashford had married a young doctor in Denver and had opened with her husband's help a free clinic for poor women in the rougher quarter of that city. She had not had a drink in 6 years. Lillian Prescott had gone to Kansas and had become a teacher at a girls' school in the town of Lawrence. She wrote occasionally. She had not yet married. She had said in her last letter that she was not certain she wished to. Beatrice Holloway, who had told Jacob in an alley behind a Casper merchant's house that she did not believe him, now worked openly for United States Marshal Frank Reeves out of his Cheyenne office. She had become in the 6 years since one of the Marshal's most valuable informants in the long, quiet war against the trafficking of women in the Western Territories. She had not married either, and Clara suspected that she would not. Genevieve Marlowe, Mrs. Robert Hollister, lived at Fort Russell with her husband and their 2 small children, and she sent Clara a long letter every month, written in the round, careful handwriting of a girl who had once been a chambermaid in the house of a corrupt federal judge in Denver. Old Pete Calloway had died in his sleep in the autumn of 1885 at the age of 73 in the back room of his inn at Lander. Jacob and Samuel had buried him on a south slope of Silver Wolf Pass that overlooked the cabin and the meadow, and they had set a stone there with his name and dates carved into it, and they visited it every spring on the anniversary of his passing. Clara watched her son and her brother-in-law in the yard, and she watched her sleeping daughter, and she watched the long red light of the setting sun on the high peaks of the Wind River Range, and she heard her husband's bootsteps come along the porch behind her, and a moment later, his great rough hand closed gently over her shoulder, and he sat down in the chair beside her without speaking. For a while they sat together in the silence. At last she said, "Jacob, do you ever think of regrets?" He considered the question. "I think," he said at last, "of the $500 in gold I paid for you in October of 1881. She turned her head to look at him, and she said. He smiled. The smile creased the lines around his eyes, which were deeper now than they had been 7 years ago, and gentler. "It was the best money I ever spent," he said. She laughed softly so as not to wake the baby. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Out in the yard, William James said something to his uncle, and Samuel laughed his rare, quiet laugh, and far above them a golden eagle turned in slow circles in the last red light over Silver Wolf Pass. The story of Jacob Hollister and his brother Samuel, and of the 6 young women they brought down out of the dark places of the Wyoming Territory, was told in the years that followed in many forms. Some of the tellings were truer than others, The newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver carried accounts of the federal trials that had brought down Judge Edmund Pierce and Deputy Marshal William Pickett and their associates, and those accounts named Jacob Hollister as the witness who had broken the case open. But they did not, for the most part, tell the personal story behind it. The personal story was passed mouth to mouth in the saloons and the sewing circles and the church basements of the high country, and it grew in the telling the way such stories do. But the truth of it was simpler than the legend. The truth was that a man had walled his heart for 11 years against the world, and a red-haired girl from Philadelphia had walked through the gap in that wall on a cold October morning, and he had let her in, and she had let him in, and together they had built a life out of what was left of two broken people, and that life had turned out to be larger than either of them had dared to imagine. The truth was that it is never too late. The truth was that the Lord, when he cannot reach a man any other way, will sometimes send him $500 in gold, and a wooden chest, and a girl with red hair standing in the mud. And he will ask that man in the quiet of his own heart what he intends to do about it. And the truth was that on a September evening in the year 1888, on a porch at Silver Wolf Pass, Jacob Hollister, who had once been a Texas Ranger, took the hand of his wife Clara, and they sat together and watched the eagle turn against the red sky over the high country, and the long winter of their lives was finally and truly behind them, and the spring of it had come. Some things are worth the long road, some loves are worth the long winter, and some debts of the heart, when they are paid at last, are paid in full.